Hello and welcome to the Supernatural track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and today we're talking about wounded warriors, the Winchesters, and PTSD. But first, I'd like my wonderful panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Travis.
Hi, my name is Travis. I'm a social worker with the Veteran Center, part of the VA, Marine Corps veteran as well. And I use pop culture to help veterans and service members with their illness.
Great. Justine?
Hi, I'm Justine Mastin. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, as well as a yoga teacher. And I have contributed to a bunch of Psych Geek books. And I've got my own that I can now show you because it just came in the mail today. Available wherever books are sold.
Awesome. And Lynn?
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and a professor at Winchester University, and a lot of my research is in pop culture, and specifically I have studied the television show Supernatural and written a lot of books on it. My last two books on Supernatural were written with the actors of Supernatural and the fans. They wrote their own chapters about what the show has meant to them. So that's Family Don't End with Blood, which is a really pretty cover. And the most recent one, There'll Be Peace When You Are Done, which is about the legacy that the show leaves behind, which is probably apropos of what we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. And as Gail Z. Martin, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, and more. I've written a chapter for There'll Be Peace When You Are Done. And I run a Supernatural fan group on Facebook, as well as being a columnist for the Winchester Family Business blog. So I went down the rabbit hole and just kept on going. So I love this show and I love to explore different facets of it. To get us started, can we do a level set on how you're defining post-traumatic stress disorder? Because it's a term that gets thrown around a lot. And as usual, there is the real clinical definition, and then there's the what everybody thinks they've picked up from TV and pop culture. And usually there's a vast divide between the two. So for the purposes of talking here, how do you want to level set that and define that term? And anybody who wants to jump in certainly can.
The way that I kind of work with it is it's a common occurrence to an uncommon problem. Risk of life, risk of death, and of your life or witnessing somebody else's life, near life, causes issues. And after a few months, if our bodies don't kind of reset, if our circuit breaker doesn't flip, then we call it PTSD.
I think maybe the most important thing to remember about it is that not every experience of trauma causes PTSD. I think sometimes, as with most things, we sort of throw that word around, and if anybody has any reaction at all to a trauma, which we all do, there's a temptation to call it PTSD, but it is an actual DSM-5 diagnosis that has particular criteria that you have to fit. So there are reactions that happen, and there's a wide variation in the kind of trauma that could kick it off in someone, and also taking into account the context of that person's life, how resilient they are, what their history has been of trauma. So we all react very differently. It's a very individualized experience.
Justine, anything you want to add to that?
They did a great job explaining. All I would add is I don't like diagnoses. That could be a whole nother conversation. And the styles of therapy that I use, narrative therapy and internal family systems, don't rely on diagnoses. However, when there is a cluster of symptoms that happen quite often, my opinion is diagnoses only make as much sense as they make to the client. So if it helps you to say, I'm dealing with PTSD, then that's meaningful for you, and I'm happy to use that language. But I've used all kinds of different language, right? And I think Supernatural is such a great way, a lens to look at trauma, because we don't have to use that language for folks who don't want to use it, right? Like, I feel like I just fought a demon. Yeah. Legit. And how you coping with that? how are you bouncing back? Are we in the PTSD or are we in the PTG, which is post-traumatic growth?
Okay. Yeah, I think the kind of thing that gets tossed around a lot on TV and in pop culture is somebody having flashbacks or nightmares, reacting to a loud, unexpected sound that might be sound like a gunshot and end up hiding under the bed or whatever the extreme reaction is. But in reality, it covers a range of reactions. And that's kind of what I want our viewers to be open to hearing as we talk about how the Winchester's life, which is pretty uncommon, has affected them in ways that are not really all that uncommon for some of the traumas that we run into in everyday life. So taking it from the top, when the boys are as well adjusted as we've ever met them in the early seasons. Now they've still been through the family trauma of losing Mary in a fire. And there's John, whose trauma from being in the war, we never have really heard about. Vietnam was certainly traumatic on many levels. We don't know what he came back with in terms of emotional baggage. But from a starting point, as we meet the boys in the early seasons, do you see any indicators that they're already dealing with some of the trauma leave behinds?
Well, I'm thinking back to the very first episode. I mean, Sam encounters a stranger in his home, and he doesn't scream and run away. And obviously we know all of his history, right? But I mean, here is someone who was trained to fight, and he went right back into his training, which I would wonder, even though we got to see a teeny tiny bit of Sam in school where he gets to go to a party and like wear a costume and stuff. I mean, how much did he actually leave the war of demon fighting behind when he went off to school?
I think Bobby.
No, go ahead, Travis.
I think Bobby says it really nicely in Swan Song in season 5 when he's talking to Dean about letting Sam let Lucifer in, right? He's just like, me and you have always been hard on him, but he's been running into burning buildings since he was 12. Mm-hmm. And that goes a long way for kind of understanding, while we don't see it, getting some context to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was going to say, I think we see a little bit of that hypervigilance that we were talking about. I mean, Sam wakes instantly and is wide awake. I mean, that's not how I wake up. If there's a noise, I'm like, oh, what was that? It's probably nothing. I'm going back to sleep. He's like instantly awake, instantly, down the stairs on tiptoed feet, stealthily. I mean, he, like Justine said, he really does snap right back into it. So clearly his upbringing is not something that he's going to leave behind. And that all those experiences he's not going to be able to leave behind just because he has tried to avoid it by changing his setting.
It reminded me of, several of my uncles fought in some of the major battles of World War II. And 40 years later, everybody knew if, hey, if Uncle Gordon's sleeping on the couch and dinner's ready, don't shake him. Call from a distance or you'll get slung. And it was nothing personal. It's just, you don't wake him by touching him. And that's after 40 years.
Yeah. That's referenced in the show at some point later on. I think when Cass tells Jack, don't ever go in and try to wake Dean up out of a sound sleep because you're going to get hit or worse. He's got his hand on the trigger of the gun or the handle of the knife under the pillow all the time. It's such a great concrete metaphor almost for that hypervigilance.
Absolutely.
So the boys start out with some degree of PTSD to start with, just from their upbringing. And of course, trauma takes many shapes. So it's not just the fighting and the danger piece. What about the trauma of effectively being homeless and living in a car and having a child guardian, not only to Sam of having another child watch him, but to Dean of being responsible? We see how much in the Striga episode, how heavy that weighed on Dean for years, that he had failed as what, an 8-year-old to keep his 4-year-old brother safe. So how about some of that? Does that qualify as PTSD on any level?
Yeah, I would say yeah, and I'm so glad that we're talking about this because so many of the people who come to see me who exhibit the cluster of symptoms that are PTSD, they're like, "Well, but nothing, no big major thing ever happened to me. I've never been assaulted. I've never been in a car accident." You know, listing all the things they've never done. It's like, well, what was growing up like? Did you have a safe place to live? Did you, you know, that bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, was was that taken care of? Because it, instead of you know, using the language of Supernatural, instead of, you know, getting stabbed in the gut, you're it's death of 1,000 paper cuts, but it'll get you just the same.
Yeah, I think something at the opening that you both said when defining PTSD was that like it's not the same, right? And I actually tell my veterans and service members I work with, like I don't even try to use that word because none of us have run through the same thing. It's always similar, right? Like I've never killed a demon, but I understand what it feels like to have to be on guard with a weapon. And you know, I've actually been woken up by one of my Marine Corps friends, and I threw a punch, so I almost punched him because he was messing with me, you know, but I was asleep and I didn't know what was going on. So I've gone through something similar. And I think that that's huge when thinking about the traumas we all go through, right? And then also that comparison, like Justine said, is I worked at a residential facility where they would talk about their traumas and compare them. Well, I was in Fallujah, I was in, you know, Ramadi. If I've been shot and you have a paper cut, let's go off of our worst pain here. You know, let's meet there and practice empathy with each other.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. I often talk about it as kind of, we expect like big T trauma, but there's so much little T trauma. And people kind of have the stereotype of, oh, trauma is a big giant thing that happens to you all at once. But sometimes it is like those thousands of paper cuts, and it can be cumulative over so long. I mean, think of those two little boys who literally, you know, Dean had 4 years of relative perceived safety, but Sam had 6 months. And after that, there was no sense of safety. Was no sense of stability. They were on the road. They were left with other people. They were left alone. I mean, we don't see a lot of it, but from the glimpses that we get, it's pretty clear that they were neglected at the very least. And of course, that's trauma, especially over such a long period of time.
Now, we've talked to some extent at other times about intergenerational trauma, and of course the Winchesters are, you know, great examples of that as well. But John coming home from Vietnam, and I'm not sure anybody came back from a tour of duty there unscathed in some way. What might he have carried with him? You know, of course, we didn't talk about this stuff back in, you know, back at that time. What unresolved traumatic issues might he have brought back and unintentionally passed on to the boys, even if to him it felt like how to protect yourself, you know, the keep your knife under your pillow, which is not what most parents usually say?
It's hard to say, but also thinking about that his trauma started before that when his dad vanished.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then that goes with a bunch of the veterans I work with. They had childhood trauma, went to the military, whether they were drafted, because I do work with Vietnam veterans, or they enlisted themselves looking for that piece, looking for that family piece. And then they get that cohesion to an extent, but then experience trauma as that cohesion. And what he brings back is like, you see it a little bit where it's like, I am valuable when he's trying to do the sigils, when they both go back in time. He reacts kind of angrily, like, hey, what are you doing, when Dean's following him when they're looking at the Impala? And he's like, oh, this is the car you want, right? So he brings back some anger and some sharpness to his hyperarousal, which is one of the DSM clustered symptoms for PTSD.
he brings back some coping strategies too that worked well for him while he was serving and don't work very well for him as a parent. His kind of default setting is, I'm going to be their drill sergeant because that's the only way in my experience that people can stay safe. So I am going to keep them safe, even if it means I'm, laying down the law and not giving them a lot of affection and treating them clearly like they're way older than they were, and parentifying Dean. So a lot of the things that John learned to survive, this is one of the things that I think probably all of us would agree that we help people with PTSD, is sometimes the coping strategies that let you survive the trauma eventually don't work very well for you and sort of start kicking you in the butt. And I think that happened with John. And it was probably complicated, honestly, by, Mary also has her own trauma history because she grew up a hunter. So they both bring in this history of trauma, and then he has more experience of trauma. And then the big trauma happens with Mary's death. And it's just already, by the time those boys were little, it's trauma, trauma, trauma.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you both talk about this, because what popped into my head, which I hadn't necessarily thought about before, was was John making little war buddies? He knew how to have those war buddies and a family in that way. And, yes, drill sergeant, and also like I'm going to make myself some little warriors that I can relate to, so we can, bond over that trauma. We can have that trauma bond.
And it's what he knew, right? It's what he knew. Talking about words and how they matter was similar and same. It's funny to me that John refers to himself as a drill sergeant when in the Marine Corps they're drill instructors. So as a Marine, it got me a little bit, but yes, he does do that drill sergeant stuff, drill instructor thing, where it's all demands, all orders, and no matter what Dean did, it was never good enough, and that added the pressure on him. And you see that throughout the flashbacks. Go ahead.
Well, we also have at least comments from the boys about how their dad made them run and train and spar, and certainly did weapons training, all of which is a competency to stay alive. And while you hope that siblings care for each other and support each other, he takes it almost to the guys in the platoon level of watching each other's back in a battle situation, with telling Dean to watch out for Sammy. And of course, Sam picks that up because that's what you're supposed to do. And I love what Lynn said about the whole fighting the last war sort of thing, where you take what you learned that got you through one trauma and you try to apply it, and maybe it's the totally wrong thing to do in the next situation, but it's what you've learned. And then there's the unlearning that has to come with it. And that's hard, especially if you're still getting hit with stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of maladaptive things that come up. Being angry on deployment gets us through things. Being angry when I'm shot at or stabbed or demons coming after me helps me focus and not feel any other emotion. Supernatural does a really good thing with the BM scene, right? That where they get to talk and they do get to process a little bit, but that doesn't always happen, and it's not always there in real life, and we don't want to open ourselves up. And you see that so many times throughout the series, where had Dean just told Sam the truth, or Sam just told Dean, things would have been so much easier. But it's bred into them like, hey, we can't talk about some of these things.
One of the things that I love so much about, well, I'm so grateful to have a 15-year arc for Supernatural, is that we do get to see so much of that actual evolution, and so much healing, and so much dropping of the coping strategies that really weren't working for Sam and Dean over the years. And it doesn't happen quickly, because in real life it doesn't happen quickly. But what a gift to let it play out so slowly over that long period of time. And when you look at where they are in those last couple of episodes and how far they've come in being able to be open and vulnerable and express their feelings, and talk about that post-traumatic growth, like appreciating the small things in life, like a pie festival, that is such a wonderful story. Like, amazingly, the story got even better by the time it ended because you really do have the gift of seeing that evolution. I love that. I miss my show. Oh, I'm getting
Yeah.
emotional.
Oh, that's so real. And it is. This takes so much time. And I can think back to myself, years and years ago being like, just talk to each other.
You could have shortened entire seasons, if they'd have
Right.
just had a conversation.
Right. We need the supernatural therapist to come in. But it is so beautiful to see how, without the supernatural therapist, they were able to get there on their own eventually. They were
I think
able to find their way.
I think one of my favorite episodes is when they take Jack to meet with the therapist that they are suspicious of and end up having a real session.
Little family therapy.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, we have come a long way at that point from when Dean comes back from hell and tells, has his breakdown by the side of the road, and also talks about how he just shoves the feelings down and lets it out in bursts of alcoholism and violence, which kind of does sum up the first half of the show.
And hypersexual, right? He's always flirting, he's trying to get girls' numbers, and because that's what makes him feel alive. It's hunting, sex, and drugs, really. That's
And
what
porn.
yeah, plus Asians. And thinking about like the veterans I work with, they all go through something very similar. The extreme sports, skydiving, driving fast, reckless behavior, all the same things you see Dean and the Impala doing. Yeah, it's really beautiful how they show so many different key points to that. And it's not just like one thing, one time, one episode. The thing I love is that they carry it. You have stuff. I mean, you can watch season 14 and some of the clips on the previously on or the road so far will be season 2 stuff on how it plays into this episode.
Yeah.
And I love that as a fan that's watched it for so long. It's like the consistency.
Yeah.
But now Sam is dealing with his trauma in a little different way often than Dean. He certainly has his hookups and his unfortunate the phenomenon of Sam's dick of death, which doesn't bode well for his partners. But so maybe it's good he isn't as hypersexual as Dean, or there'd be a higher body count. But he definitely comes at these things differently. So what do we see in Sam's coping mechanisms?
Yeah, I think part of what I've seen of Sam is, he got a little more of that questioner, right? Because he was the younger of the two. He didn't have the responsibility Dean did. He got to be a little bit more questioning. He got to do a little bit more life fanfic and go, well, what would happen if I did this? And what would happen if I do that? And I think I want to go to college. And he got to meet other people and interact with more other humans. And it seems to me that he picked more up around, like, to be a healthy human, you need to eat some green things sometimes and run when you're not just when you're being chased. And like he picked up some self-care stuff along the way that, to my mind, Dean was just too shut off from, because, he had to be Little John, and Little John didn't give a shit about eating greens and taking a jog.
I just feel like Sam had a more secure attachment than Dean, because thanks to Dean, Sam could do the rebellion because he knew there was a secure base for him to come back to, because it was Dean. Sam could reach out and question and try different things and be more relational because he knew he could fall back on Dean. Whereas I don't think Dean probably had a secure attachment for the first few years of his life, and then it was wrenched out from under him in a really difficult way. So I think Sam was less frightened than Dean to be relational, and even sort of to be more relational and more real with Dean from the beginning. Sam was willing. I'm doing a rewatch of season 1 now, and one of the contrasts between them in season 1. It's not that Dean doesn't open up sometimes. He does. He opens up more than I remembered. I think I've stereotyped him into more of a macho kind of shut off person than he actually was. But there's still a contrast between him and Sam. Sam's the one who's willing to say, why are we not questioning what Dad's doing? Sam's the one to say, Dean, what's the matter with you? Why are you acting like you just have to do everything he says? Whereas Dean is, I gotta stick to the straight and narrow. I gotta keep us safe. I gotta figure out what's going on here. So I think that was a difference between them from the beginning, and that allowed Sam to react differently to the traumas that came along than Dean did.
Yeah, it makes me think about later in the series when Dean recognizes that in Sam, right? And like they're like with the British Man of Letters stuff, like, Sam, no, you're in charge. You're the leader.
Yeah.
That's not me. That's not my role. I'm the older brother, but you're more well-rounded. These people are going to listen to you and respect you more. So I really like that. And then also thinking about like the Supernatural Con, the convention they go to, and watching them interact from like season 1 in the fans and hearing the banter between them, I think like helped. I mean, I love the fact they just, made fun of themselves and looked at it. But I think it does kind of open their eyes like, oh yeah, like there is differences.
Yeah.
Well, Sam was able, after John's death in season 2, to really know that he was not okay, and to make it very clear to Dean that regardless of how he was denying it and trying to avoid it, the Dean was not okay and pushing the issue. It may not have been the most deft way to come at it, but given that they were working with what they had to work with, he was at least facing it. Sam's a head guy. Dean took stuff out with his fist. Sam seemed to retreat to his head, and whether that is spiraling anxiety or just an overdeveloped need to analyze, how does that reaction play into what we're talking about here?
The nerd.
What'd you say, Justine? I missed that.
I said he's a nerd. He's our fandom's nerd.
I was going to say he was an internalizer and Dean is kind of an externalizer. But I think, we see the impact of Sam's trauma in a more understated way than we see the impact of Dean's trauma, but we do see it. And part of that, I'm always so impressed with how Jared Padalecki felt that it was really important to show that Sam was having PTSD from some of the things. And even when it wasn't written into the script in a big way, he's not beating up the Impala or beating up some stranger or drinking himself to death or any of the things that are very obvious seen. Jared always made sure to put in things like when he was around Lucifer or Lucifer's vessel, the flinching and the sudden jumping, and he kept that kind of subtle stuff up for season after season after season. And I do think it was largely him, because those kind of stage directions are not often in the script, but he felt it was important to acknowledge that Sam's PTSD was still there. He talks about it with Rowena. There's a couple of scenes where we get to hear it, but most of the time we just get Jared's small physical reaction so that we can see that it's still there.
Just what you're talking about made me think about when they're doing therapy with Lucifer and God, and like, let's use I statements. Like, I started laughing so hard when I saw that. It was so good. But yeah, I mean, you do see it throughout the time, and finding that balance where Sam does work on that. And yeah, he is a more head guy. He's more in his head. He does throw fists as well, right? But so he understands that he needs to be the person he is in that moment, and not always this one way. Because when you limit yourself like that, you're stuck and you go in that repeat cycle where he's like, no, let's look at things differently.
And sometimes Sam is in his head a lot, but we also see Sam having hallucinations and delusions and not being able to tell reality from his trauma and having really serious flashbacks. So while all of that is the whole time that it's happening, you're not really sure what's going on. Is Lucifer here? Is Lucifer not here? For a long time, it's not clear what's happening. But Sam goes through some real cognitive stress and gets very fractured for a while. So I think that's probably the most dramatic stuff that we see with Sam. I was also convinced for most of season 8 that Amelia was completely a fabricated illusion. And I will go to my deathbed thinking they started the season intending that that's what it was going to be, and then switched gears somewhere in the season and said, oh no, never mind. This is too hard to do. Let's make it really have happened.
Which would have been such an interesting twist for
Would have
her
been great.
to have not existed and really just been his coping strategy.
Yes.
Yeah, I would have loved seeing that. Now, we talked about Dean being parentified to take care of Sam, but that very deep brother bond, which we all love, also has some less healthy pieces to it in terms of selling one's soul multiple times, running into burning buildings, those kinds of things. So whether it's enabling or codependence or being a little too tightly bonded, how does that play in with the whole rest of the trauma piece? Finding an anchor and holding on for dear life.
I mean, I think partly it's because PTSD and experience of trauma can leave people very reluctant to trust other people. You know, once you kind of have a worldview that you've learned that really bad things can happen, you're not going to let a whole lot of people in really easily. So, you know, there's one point where Dean explains to Mary after she came back, like, our whole lives, all Sam and I have had other than the car is each other. So, I mean, I don't know how they could have turned out any other way. There's a reason that in the last episode, Brothers in Arms is the song playing at Dean's funeral pyre, because they were that, but they were kind of everything to each other, because there weren't a whole lot of people that they really let in. I mean, again, that evolution, eventually you saw them let certain select people in at least part way, which I think was a really big deal for them, but there was no one that they really trusted the way they trusted each other. And that, I think that is a challenge in real life when you've been through these kind of bad experiences, to learn to trust people again so that you can have those relationships and that support system that everybody actually needs.
Yeah. No one else could possibly understand what they had gone through. I mean, even other hunters hadn't lived through what they lived through. And, you know, Bobby kind of got it, and Bobby was there for them. And thank goodness Bobby was there, because they had some outside influence. And I know some fans didn't like when new characters got added, because it's like it takes away from the boys. But I feel like that was really neat. Like, we need some outside influence here. We can't, if we only ever see and talk to each other, we're learning that in this pandemic, right? Like, it's too much. It's just us and our trauma in the car.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
it's overwhelming.
and I think it's kind of important to note that, you know, we love this show, so we're talking about, and I adore this show, but
Mm-hmm.
and I think there is so much that we can learn from this show, and I think we all use it with our clients, and I use it in my teaching, but I would never say that this is the paragon of what we all want to do. Part of the appeal of the show is that this was so unique. And do you want to limit your world to one other person in real life? Oh, hell no. Is it compelling on a television show? Oh, hell yes. So I think sometimes that's a good caveat when we're talking about using media to inspire in real life, that we're not telling anyone you should be just like the Winchesters. No, you should not be. That's what makes it such compelling television, and I adore them, but no, you should not be the Winchesters.
Right. They're a what probably not to do. Yeah.
One of the veterans I recommended watching the show too was because she wanted a relationship with her brother. They were both Army veterans and struggled with their own traumas in their own ways. And she wanted that relationship. And she finally understood that it wasn't going to happen. But through Supernatural, she's able to see that family is thicker than blood, right? She gets to choose a family also. And that gave her hope in wanting to connect and reconnect with civilization and people and open herself up to that, is by watching the show and having people like Bobby Cass, Rowena, Crowley even be involved, not to mention all the other hunters that get brought in.
One of the episodes we really can't skip talking about is when Sam is really encountering the other Sams in his head and having to make peace with them or destroy them or incorporate them as a metaphor for bringing his shattered self together. Where does that imagery factor in with what we're talking about?
With me, I talk to a lot of people about when they get out of the military. And I really think that amplifies their symptoms because they lose that sense of who they were. So I help reconnect them to the other parts of themselves, that their son or a daughter or a brother, a mother, a wife, a husband. They're not just a Marine or a soldier or a sailor. And that goes with Sam, is kind of connecting that you're different pieces at different times. And that doesn't just mean that when one goes away, you go away. You are more than that.
One of the things that can come out of what we call post-traumatic growth, because trauma disrupts our sense of identity and sort of knocks everything off the timeline. And one of the things that healing brings is sort of consolidating that identity back together and integrating the trauma back into the rest of life. And I do think, while I said you don't want to be the Winchesters, there's a lot that we can take from it that did go in the right way. And one of the things I really like is by the end, Sam and Dean both had a solid sense of their identity. And actually Castiel too. I think his arc was going in the same way. He figured out who he was, not just, a good soldier following God, not just the rebel angel, not just someone who was separate from humanity, but someone who had learned from humanity and found his own path and his own meaning. And I think Sam and Dean did a fabulous job of that. Near the end, there's a time when Dean says to Sam, I'm good with who I am. I'm good with who you are. And by the end, you could really see in that, little compressed 5-year montage of ordinary life, they found who they were and they found a lot of peace and a lot of happiness in that. So that part of it, I think, is very hopeful.
Yeah.
Even before that, when in Lebanon, when John came back and Dean makes that statement about being okay with them, that's such a powerful thing for him to say about himself, but also such a powerful affirmation for Sam to hear, because there were so many times when Dean wasn't okay with who Sam was. And it took longer for Sam to let go of that than I think it took Dean to let go of that. And so that needed to be said. And I was so glad that it was written in and we didn't have to just do headcanon with that.
Yeah. I love that we got to explore something that I believe, which is we don't just have a unitary mind. We don't just have one way that we live, right? There are many parts of us. And, Travis gave voice to this. There are all these different parts of us. And, when we get traumatized, some of those parts get really big or really disruptive or, really pushing people away. And we want to keep all of them, right? We're not trying to get rid of anybody. Just want everybody to do a job suitable to their needs. Right? And yeah, we have all these parts of ourselves, and to see the boys start to recognize that about each other, like they're not just hunters, they're not just brothers. These are things they are. But I mean, Sam is a complicated human being with lots of parts, and so's Dean. And when they can recognize that about each other and be like, you know what? All the parts of me don't dig all the parts of you, but they all love all the parts of you. And that's beautiful. And I think that's something we can take out of the show and into the real world, is we can love people with all their parts. And some of those parts are, pretty flawed. And that's okay. That can be wonderful. As long as it's not harming anyone.
Yes. And the same goes for ourselves. You know, I still don't, I'm not wild about the part of me that just wants to eat coffee ice cream every night, but that is a part of me. And I have come to
Mhm.
accept that that's a part of me. And also, coffee ice cream is just delicious. So, you know,
Both things are true.
that's right. Both things are true. I can handle that contradiction in my head and be okay with it.
Cycling back to the beginning again, where we talked about how Sam tried so hard to separate himself, but when conditions warranted, he snapped right back into his training and what he had learned. I've had this conversation with so many people since we've been in the current unpleasantness and the lockdown. And at one point, my husband looked at me and said, "How are you handling this so well?" And I said, "Adaptive trauma here. I just snapped right back into the skills. It's like, oh, here we are again. We know how to run this." And I've had that conversation with a number of other trauma survivors who have said, I thought I'd left this stuff behind, and now it's all coming back up because I'm reacting to the current situation. And I think we saw Sam and Dean do that over and over again. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but we got to kind of watch it, don't we? To make sure that it's appropriate.
It's a type of mindfulness. I mean, Lynn actually spoke to this beautifully about the ice cream, right? There's that part of you that's just gonna go for the ice. You see it, you're gonna go for it, and you have to kind of check in and go, I notice I'm grabbing for the ice cream. Is that, now that I've noticed, what choice do I want to make? And
Yeah.
we could say the same. I notice I'm opening the trunk and grabbing a crossbow. Is this the choice I want to make?
Makes the neighbors talk.
It goes back to those coping strategies, right? I mean, some of the coping strategies that we bring with us from our experience of trauma make us more resilient and give us a sense of our own strength and competence. And we are the people who can say, oh, I've been through worse. I can make it through this. So there can be a strength that comes from it, but we don't want to react to everything in that way because that leaves us cut off from some things that might be beneficial to us. The whole world, it seems like the whole world is trauma right now because of everything that's happening, but the whole world is not trauma. And so we don't want to react to the entire world like it is full of trauma.
And we see Dean kind of go through this because there's times where he's just like, I give up. Where's the bar? I'm gonna go drink. And Sam's like, no, we're gonna keep fighting. You always keep fighting, right? I mean, that goes with everything they do. And because there are so many times where the cards are just stacked against them. And it's that resiliency that you kind of mentioned earlier, Justine, that's just kind of bouncing back and coming back. Sometimes it is a little bit easier, like, oh, during the current unpleasantness, oh, my guys and gals have been like, oh, now I can isolate and it's okay. And it reinforced those skills, but it's like, what else do you want to do, right? Who else are you? How are you servicing? If you're a scuba diver, but you're not diving, your gills aren't getting wet. How are you kind of embracing that person? And that's the same with the brothers. It's like, how are you embracing it? Well, you know what? I'm a drink, but then I'm gonna keep going too.
Well, believe it or not, folks, we are through our time. And I love that we brought it to a point of always keep fighting and resiliency, because that's where we saw the boys at the end. And that's certainly, where we hope to find the peace when we are done. So thank you so much for the conversation. I think we, could keep going for quite a long time, but let's tell everybody again where they can find you online or your books online or whatever like that you want to share. Travis, go ahead.
I write for the series of popular psychology books with Travis Langley, who's been on here before. I have a couple of them right here, like Supernatural, Westworld, and Daredevil. You can find me on Twitter at the Marine_Peer, PEER.
Awesome. Justine?
You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Mind Body Fandom, because I take a holistic approach, mind, body, and fandom. You can also find me on my website, blueboxcounseling.com or starshiptherapies.com with an S, just like the Enterprise. And you can get Starship Therapies using therapeutic fanfiction to rewrite your life wherever books are sold. It's in pre-sales, but you will get your copy on May the 4th, Star Wars Day.
Yay! And Lynn?
You can find me on all social media at Fangasm SPN. I also have a blog, fangasmthebook.com. If you're looking for the books on Supernatural, you can find them at the website peacewhenyouaredone.com. And you can also find me online writing for Movie TV Tech Geeks and Frolic. And I have a blog on Psychology Today also.
And of course, you can find me at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com, which is my romance pen name. I'm usually here on Continual or on or in my Supernatural fan group. And so thank you all very, very much for spending part of your day with us and for discussing the topic. And thank all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural coming up here on Continual. We'll see you online.